I grew up in a Christian home. Since I was little, my parents took me to church every Sunday. They were always strong in their faith and taught me to pray before meals, before bed, and to thank God for everything. I remember that, as a child, all of this felt like part of the routine, something automatic, natural. I knew the Bible stories by heart. I knew who David and Moses were, and I knew God's promises. But even back then, there was something I didn't understand. Despite knowing everything about God, I had never truly felt His presence. He seemed distant, far from me. As I grew older, that sense of distance only grew. In church, I saw people talk about miracles, about how God answered their prayers and how they felt His presence in every part of their lives. But for me, it was different. I followed the steps, I prayed, I went to services, but inside it felt like I was just repeating empty words. I didn't feel anything. There was a void inside me that I didn't know how to fill. In my teenage years, I began asking questions that no one seemed to have answers for. If God was so good, why couldn't I feel His presence? Why was the world full of suffering and injustice? Why, while some people said God was blessing them with miracles, did it feel like He was absent from my life? These questions began to haunt me, but I never voiced them. I was afraid of being seen as someone who didn't believe enough, or worse, someone who was drifting away from the faith. So I kept those doubts to myself. Years went by, and the responsibilities of adult life started piling up. That's when things really started to fall apart. My job, which I had thought was stable, suddenly became uncertain. At one point, I was almost fired, and the financial insecurity hit me hard. I no longer had the confidence that I could sustain my life and my dreams. On top of that, my relationship, which I believed was solid, began to crumble. At first, it was small arguments, but they grew into something bigger, until, inevitably, it ended. When that happened, it was like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Alone. That was the word that best described my life at that moment. It felt like I was living on an isolated island, where no one could reach me, not even God. I remember nights when I would kneel in my room, desperately searching for some kind of answer. I would ask, God, what's happening? Why can't I feel you? Why does my life seem to be falling apart? And you're doing nothing? But there was no answer. There were no signs, only a crushing silence. Over time, that silence turned into frustration. The more I prayed, the more distant God seemed. I began to question whether He was really listening. I started to doubt if He really cared. It felt like He was busy with other people while I struggled on my own, trying to keep my life from falling apart. As these doubts grew, I started to drift away. I still went to church. I still prayed out of habit. But inside, something was broken. The truth is, I was tired. Tired of fighting alone. Tired of praying and not being answered. And it was in that moment of total exhaustion that I began to think, does God really exist? Is all this faith I was taught since childhood real? Or am I just trying to believe in something to make myself feel better? These questions tormented me every day. I remember one time during a service, the pastor started talking about faith and how God is always present, even when we don't see Him. But I couldn't hear those words anymore without feeling deep frustration. He said God answers every prayer, but in my life, it felt like the answers never came. I looked around and saw people crying, raising their hands in worship, moved by God's presence. And me? I felt nothing. It was like I was trapped in a bubble, disconnected from everything. It was at this point that something inside me began to break. I couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. I couldn't keep living with a surface-level faith while feeling nothing inside. I needed an answer. I needed something real. That's when I decided that if God was real, I needed proof. A concrete proof that He was listening. I didn't want to hold on to empty words anymore. I wanted to see God act in my life in a way I couldn't ignore. One night, exhausted from so many unanswered questions, I made the boldest prayer I'd ever made. I was in my room, on my knees, with the lights off and a heavy heart. I said, God, if you are really there, prove it to me. I can't live with this doubt anymore. I can't take this silence any longer. If you're real, I need to know. I need to know. When I finished that prayer, I stayed there for a few minutes, waiting for something. Maybe a sign, a feeling, an immediate answer. But as always, all I heard was silence. The same silence that had accompanied me for years. I got up, discouraged, believing nothing had changed. After that night, when I made the boldest prayer of my life, something inside me began to shift. Not in a positive way, like I had hoped, but with an even greater sense of emptiness. God's silence seemed louder than ever. It felt like the walls of my room had grown taller and thicker, isolating me completely from the outside world, and especially from God. The next morning, I woke up with a weight on my chest. Frustration had taken over me. I was exhausted. Exhausted from praying, exhausted from trying, exhausted from believing in something that didn't seem to make any difference in my life. The feeling of fighting alone, with no one listening, was crushing. I started to ask myself, has everything I've learned up until now been a lie? Does God really exist, or am I just talking to the walls? The days began to blur together. I went to work, talked to friends, did what needed to be done, but inside there was a sadness and restlessness that wouldn't leave me. I felt lost in my own thoughts, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. Things only seemed to get worse. At work, the pressures were mounting. I was on the verge of losing my job, and I couldn't find a solution to the problems that kept piling up. My boss had started questioning my performance, and each day felt like a battle to stay afloat. My self-esteem was at an all-time low. My professional failures added to my spiritual doubts, and I began to feel completely powerless. But beyond that, what bothered me the most was that my personal life was also crumbling. I always thought my relationship was strong, but I began to realize that what I thought was a solid foundation was actually full of cracks. Small arguments turned into heated fights, and the distance between us grew every day. Until one day, she said she couldn't take it anymore. She left, and I found myself completely alone. Alone. That was the word that best described my life at that moment. It felt like I was living on an isolated island where no one could reach me, not even God. I remember one night in particular. It was raining heavily, and the sound of the raindrops hitting the window was the only noise in my apartment. I sat on the couch, staring into the void, feeling like that sound perfectly mirrored my emotional state. A never-ending storm, no answers, no direction. At that moment, I suddenly stood up, driven by a rage I didn't even know I had inside me. I walked over to the mirror, and looking into my own eyes, I started to speak. It wasn't exactly a prayer. It was more like a cry of desperation, of frustration, as if I was trying to get God's attention any way I could. If you're real, why don't you do something? Why are you leaving me here alone? I can't take it anymore. I shouted those words with tears streaming down my face. I've always believed in you. I've always heard that you're present in every situation. So where are you now? I never thought I'd reach the point of talking to God like that. You know, my whole life, I was taught to respect God, to speak to him with reverence. But at that moment, all I had was pain, and I didn't know how else to express it. After a few minutes, exhaustion overtook me in a way I couldn't control. I felt my legs give out, and I knelt there, in the middle of the living room, drenched in tears and anger. It was then that, for the first time, I said something I never thought I'd say. God, if you're really real, prove it to me. I need proof because I can't believe anymore. I had never challenged God like that before. Deep down, I had always been afraid to question him so directly. But at that moment, there was nothing left to lose. I was at my limit, and this was my last shot. I waited. I waited for some sign, for some response. I didn't know what I was expecting to see or hear, but I waited anyway. Maybe I wanted a bright light or a strong, clear voice telling me, I am here. Maybe I wanted to feel a sudden peace that would fill my heart and silence all my doubts. But once again, all I heard was silence. That crushing silence that seemed to respond with an even greater emptiness. Slowly, I stood up, feeling more lost than ever. It felt like the hole inside me was getting deeper. I didn't know what else to do. I had made the most sincere request of my life, and still nothing happened. I was alone. The days that followed that prayer were strange. I didn't know what to expect after challenging God so directly. In fact, a part of me believed that maybe I had made a mistake, that maybe God was angry or would simply remain silent forever. After all, who was I to demand proof from the creator of the universe? But at the same time, there was something inside me that couldn't let go entirely. That week, I went back to my routine. Work, home, small social interactions. But something felt different. As much as I tried to ignore it, small events began to happen. Things that at first seemed insignificant but soon captured my attention. The first sign happened one morning. I was on the bus on my way to work, staring out the window as my thoughts wandered. I felt tired, physically and emotionally. I was so absorbed in my own thoughts that I barely noticed the conversation between two people sitting behind me. They were talking about how God always answers prayers, but often in ways we don't expect. One of them said something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Sometimes, God doesn't speak with a loud voice. Sometimes He whispers in the middle of the chaos of our lives, and it's up to us to listen. I froze. How could those words be so precise in relation to what I was going through? It was as if those people were speaking directly to me without even knowing it. I couldn't ignore the coincidence. But then, another voice inside me said, "This is nothing. You're just seeing what you want to see." I wrestled with that thought for the rest of the day, trying to decide if it was really a sign or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. In the following days, other things started to happen. I was listening to the radio while driving home, something I did routinely. Suddenly, a song I had never heard before started playing. The lyrics were about how God never abandons us, even when we feel lost and alone. With each verse, it felt like something inside me was being touched. The chorus said, "You're never alone. Even in the silence, I'm right beside you." I was stunned. God, is this you speaking to me? I wondered. But again, that skeptical voice chimed in. It's just a song, coincidence, nothing more. This battle between believing and doubting started to dominate my thoughts. Every little thing that happened made me question. Should I believe that this is God answering my prayer? Or is all of this just my imagination, a desperate attempt to find a sign where there is none? One day, something even more incredible happened. I was having lunch alone at a cafe, trying to clear my mind, when an elderly man I had never seen before approached me. He looked me in the eyes and, without any introduction, said something that froze me. "I know you're looking for an answer. God is listening to you. Keep believing." I was completely speechless. How could he know? I had never seen this man before, and he simply said the words I most needed to hear. Everything inside me screamed, "This is God." But once again, my mind tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe he's just speaking in general. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Still, in that moment, something deep inside me began to change. The doubt was still there, but it now shared space with a hope I hadn't felt in a long time. I began to realize that these little things, the conversation on the bus, the song on the radio, the man in the cafe, weren't just isolated coincidences. They were forming a pattern. It was as if God was really trying to speak to me, but in a way so subtle that, if I wasn't paying attention, I could easily ignore it. In the days that followed, I started praying again. but in a different way. It was no longer a desperate prayer, demanding an immediate answer. It was more like a conversation, a search to understand the signs I was receiving. I would say, "Lord, I don't know if this is you or if it's just me trying to force something, but if it is you, keep speaking. I want to listen." Each day I felt that God was surrounding me with small messages, and each one was like a piece of a puzzle I needed to solve. I began paying more attention, not just to big events, but to the small things, words I overheard, conversations, subtle signs. It was as if God was teaching me to listen with my heart, not just with my ears. I was beginning to understand that God doesn't need to shout to be heard. He was whispering, and for the first time, I was learning how to listen. However, even with all these signs, I still struggled with my doubts. The skeptical voice was still there. Part of me wanted to believe, but another part was terrified of being disappointed again. I didn't want to believe in something that would turn out to be false in the end. But despite my doubts, something inside me had shifted. I began to feel a little bit of peace, a peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a complete peace, but it was enough to keep me going. It was enough to give me hope that maybe, just maybe, God was really speaking to me. And what had started as a prayer of desperation was slowly turning into a dialogue with the Creator, even if I still couldn't fully understand how He was manifesting Himself. Despite all the signs I'd been noticing, there was still a battle raging inside me. Doubt and faith were constantly at odds, leaving me in a state of inner turmoil. Part of me believed that God was speaking to me in subtle ways, ways I had never experienced before. But the other part, that skeptical side of me that I had carried for years, kept whispering that it could all be in my head. Then something happened that changed everything. An encounter I could have never predicted. Something so clear and powerful that it shattered the last remnants of doubt I was holding on to. It was a Saturday morning, a day that seemed like any other. I remember feeling particularly exhausted that week, physically and emotionally drained. I went for a walk at a nearby park, something I usually did to clear my mind. The park was relatively empty that day, and the sky was overcast, reflecting some of the darkness I still felt inside. I sat on a bench, looking at the trees, trying to organize my thoughts. I was just sitting there, hoping to find some peace, when I noticed an elderly man approaching. He wore a simple hat and walked slowly. There was nothing particularly special about him, except that he seemed to be walking toward me with clear intention. When he got closer, I looked up and tried to smile, not expecting much from the interaction. To my surprise, he stopped right in front of me, looked me in the eyes, and without any introduction said, "You think God isn't listening to you, don't you?" The shock I felt was indescribable. How could he know? I hadn't spoken to anyone about my struggles, about my doubts. This was a battle I had been fighting alone, in silence. My heart raced. This man, without knowing anything about me, had just touched on the deepest part of my life. His words pierced directly into my heart, as if he were reading my soul. I was speechless, trying to make sense of what was happening. My entire body froze, and for a few seconds, I couldn't even think clearly. Then the man continued, "I don't know what you're going through, but God wants you to know that He's always been listening. He heard your prayer, and He has a purpose for your life. Don't give up. The answer is closer than you think." His words echoed inside me. I felt something beyond what simple words could provoke. It was as if each syllable he spoke was filled with an invisible power, an undeniable truth that went far beyond what I could comprehend. At that moment, I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't a coincidence. God was responding to me, clearly, directly. He had sent someone to say exactly what I needed to hear. All the defenses I had built over the years, all the barriers I had constructed, began to crumble. I couldn't hold back the tears. I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Emotion overwhelmed me in a way I couldn't control. That man, without any further explanation, simply smiled at me, gave me a slight nod, and continued walking. I sat there motionless. My body felt glued to the bench, while my mind tried to process what had just happened. I knew that encounter wasn't by chance. It was impossible for it to be a coincidence. God had spoken to me in a way that was so clear, so undeniable, that all my doubts disappeared. I remember sitting there for a few more minutes, crying, but not out of sadness, out of relief. Relief that I finally understood that God had never left me. He had been there all along, even when I couldn't feel him. And now he had responded in the most clear way possible. In that moment, I knew that God was real. Not because someone told me, not because I read it in a book, but because I had experienced his presence directly. I had challenged him to prove that he existed, and he did exactly that. After I managed to calm down, I stood up from the bench with a completely new feeling. It was as if all the weight I had been carrying for years had been lifted off my shoulders. The world around me seemed lighter, clearer. The clouds in the sky began to part, and the sunlight streamed through the leaves of the trees, illuminating the park. It was as if the world itself was reflecting the transformation that had just taken place inside me. I didn't walk back home the same way I had left. That supernatural encounter had changed me completely. For the first time in years, I no longer felt alone. I no longer had that void inside me that haunted me day and night. God had spoken, and I had listened. I finally understood that God doesn't need big signs to reveal himself. He speaks in subtle yet powerful ways. He whispers in the silence, and sometimes he sends someone with the exact message you need to hear. Since that day, my faith has never been the same. Not that all my problems disappeared, but now I knew that God was with me, and that changed everything. I didn't need proof anymore. I had experienced enough to know with absolute certainty that he is real. After that supernatural encounter in the park, something inside me changed forever. I returned home with a peace I had never felt before, a peace that didn't come from external circumstances, but from an unshakable certainty. God is real, and he is with me. He always has been. The emptiness I had carried for years, the feeling of abandonment, the overwhelming doubt about his existence, all of it was dissolved in that moment. In the days that followed, the changes began to manifest in every aspect of my life. Before, I would wake up each morning with a sense of heaviness, as if the world was resting on my shoulders. Now there was a lightness. It was as if I was starting to live again. The struggles and challenges didn't magically disappear, but I wasn't facing them alone anymore. I knew that God was by my side, guiding me, sustaining me. I remember that one of the first things I did after that encounter in the park was to return to prayer, but in a completely different way. Before, my prayers had been full of desperation, questions, doubts, and demands. I begged for answers, but I didn't know if anyone was listening. Now I prayed with confidence, with a heart full of gratitude. I no longer needed proof. God had revealed himself in such a clear way that it was impossible to go back to being the person I was before. My prayer became a conversation, a sincere exchange with God, knowing that he was there, listening to every word. I wasn't speaking into the void anymore. I was talking to my Father. This internal transformation began to affect everything around me. Work, which had once felt like an unbearable burden, started to feel more manageable. Of course, the challenges were still there, but I faced them with a new perspective. I no longer saw every obstacle as proof that God had abandoned me, but as an opportunity to grow, knowing that he was with me every step of the way. Even in terms of my relationship, which had ended, something inside me began to shift. I realized that God had bigger plans for me, and that the breakup, as painful as it was part of something greater. Instead of holding on to the past, I began seeking what God wanted for my future. There was an inexplicable peace in knowing that, even when things didn't go according to my plan, He had a much bigger purpose than I could see at the moment. The people around me also began to notice the changes. Friends and family who knew about my struggles and doubts were surprised to see me more serene, more firm in my faith. Some even asked me what had happened. That's when I realized something even deeper. My testimony wasn't just for me. God had transformed my life so that I could share it with others. I understood that my story wasn't just mine. It was a story of transformation that could inspire others who were going through the same doubts and uncertainties that I had. I started to talk more openly about what had happened to me. At first, it was difficult. There was still a part of me that was reserved, that was afraid of being judged or misunderstood. But slowly, I realized that there were many people around me who were facing the same struggles I had faced. They too questioned God's existence, felt alone and abandoned, and I had something to offer them: hope. I didn't need a stage or a microphone. The conversations began in small circles of friends, then with coworkers, and eventually even with strangers whom God seemed to place in my path. I shared how, in my darkest moments, when I thought God had abandoned me, He had been working silently, preparing an answer that would transform my life. The greatest lesson I learned and began to share with others is that God doesn't always act in the ways we expect. He rarely responds with thunder or giant signs. He works behind the scenes in moments of silence and calls us to pay attention to things we often overlook. He reveals Himself in the small things, in unexpected conversations, in the songs that touch our hearts at just the right moment, and sometimes through people He places in our lives, just like that man in the park. Today, when someone tells me they're going through a crisis of faith, that they can't hear God or feel His presence anymore, I tell them my story. I say that I've been exactly where they are. I also thought God had abandoned me, but the truth is, He never left. This new mission of sharing my testimony began to bring me a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. Work continued to be important, but now I knew that my true purpose went beyond any career or material success. It was about impacting lives, about sharing God's love and presence with those who were in the same darkness I had once been in. Of course, my life didn't become perfect. The journey of faith is continuous, and I still face challenges and difficult moments. But the difference is that now I know who I can trust. God is no longer a distant idea or an abstract concept. He is real, He is present, and He loves me. And that certainty changes everything. One of the most significant moments of this new phase of my life happened a few months after that encounter in the park. I was at a small Bible study gathering with some friends. One of the participants began to share how he was going through a phase of deep doubt. He couldn't pray anymore. He couldn't feel God's presence, and he wondered if it was still worth trying to believe. As he spoke, I saw in his eyes the same despair that I had carried for so long. His words were almost a reflection of mine. He was in the same place I had been, questioning, doubting, and on the verge of giving up. I waited for him to finish, and then calmly, I began to share my story. I told him about how I had also doubted God's existence, about the desperate prayers that seemed to fall into the void, and about how, in that park, God had responded in a way I never expected. I told him about the small signs, about how God works in silence but in powerful ways. And most importantly, I told him that God was still listening to his prayers, even if he couldn't feel it at that moment. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said something that deeply impacted me. I thought I was alone. Thank you for showing me that God is still here. That was the moment when I fully understood the purpose God had given to my story. It wasn't just for my own healing and renewal. It was to help others find their way back to Him, even when everything seemed lost. Today, I live a life with purpose. Every conversation, every encounter can be an opportunity to talk about God's love and His faithfulness. I've learned that God is bigger than our doubts, and He is always present, even when we can't see Him. My journey of faith didn't end with that encounter in the park. It continues every day. And with each step, I remember what God did for me. And I keep looking for ways to share that truth with the world. God is real. He is with us, always. And He answers our prayers in ways that go far beyond what we can imagine. The story I've just shared with you isn't just about a miracle or an answer I received from God. It's a story of transformation, a journey through doubts and pain that led me to a true encounter with the Creator. I asked God to prove to me that He was real, and He responded in a way that changed my life forever. Maybe you, who are listening to this testimony, are going through something similar. Maybe you're questioning whether God really hears you, if He's by your side during your hardest moments. I want to tell you, with all sincerity in my heart, He is. Even in the silence, even when it seems like your prayers aren't being answered, God is at work. He has never abandoned you. I know how hard it is to believe when everything around you feels empty. I know how difficult it is to trust when all you feel is silence. But remember this: God speaks in many ways. Sometimes He whispers through small coincidences, through people who cross our path, through words that touch our hearts in unexplainable ways. And when we least expect it, He responds in a clear, powerful, and transformative way. Today, I am living proof that God is faithful and that He never fails. If you're searching for answers, don't give up. Keep seeking, keep praying, keep listening. Because when God speaks, He doesn't just answer our questions. He transforms our lives. God loves you, He hears you, and He is ready to act in your life, just as He did in mine. All you need to do is trust and place all your doubts in His hands. And be prepared, because God's answer may come in ways you never imagined. If this story touched your heart in any way, I want to ask something special of you. Share this testimony with someone who might also be in need of a word of hope. Maybe you know someone who's going through doubts, facing difficult times, or feels distant from God. This message might be exactly what that person needs to find strength and renew their faith. You never know how God can use a simple act of sharing to impact someone's life. So send this video to a friend, to your family, or to that person you know needs to hear that God is real, that He responds, and that He never abandons us. And don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to receive more powerful testimonies like this. May God bless your life and fill you with peace and faith.